is look at the answers to the three questions above. What's your current state? What's your ideal state? What do you own and what do you not own? If I'm looking at this right now, I would say, what's an activity I can add that would get me towards my ideal state? What's an activity that or what's a part of this that I own that I can either improve or double down on? And what part of this is outside of my control that I can eliminate from my scope, right?
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Intention Podcast. This is Doug here with Ronnie. Another exciting episode. Howdy, howdy. And this week's episode is a little bit different. Our first episode in the Living with Intention Facilitation Series. So excited to get started with this. We're going to be talking about the personal inventory and the life audit. So great tools to add to your tool belt. The goal of this episode is to really be able to follow along, pause if you need to, take notes, do some reflections, or if you want to listen to the whole thing through and then kind of go back and chop it up so that you can walk away with some things that you can start to implement and incorporate into your life. You'll see the difference between the two, between the personal inventory and the life audit once we get started. But without further ado, we will dive right in, starting with the personal inventory. Ronnie, do you want to walk us through the basics of what this personal inventory is before we get into some of the sample questions you can ask?
Yeah. So personal inventory, and just before we get into this stuff, guys, biggest thing with these Living with Intention Facilitation Series is stuff that Doug and I have kind of come up with in our own journeys. We've done some research ourselves. We've seen what works, what doesn't work for ourselves, and we're actually wired quite differently. So a lot of things that might work for Doug don't work for me, and vice versa. So we've made it a practice to kind of take what's useful and discard what's not, and we hope that you'll kind of do the same. So the personal inventory, let's just start with what is it. This is typically going to be a couple hour long, anywhere from an hour to maybe 4 hour long exercise that I would recommend you do when you're really in the throes of burnout at work. Maybe you are feeling you're feeling stuck. You're feeling like you're on a treadmill and the rest of the world is moving in really quickly. I know that for me personally, I get this way at work from time to time. I work at a tech startup, and it can just really feel pretty overwhelming. And sometimes I get really burnt out and I start just doing things that are kind of counterproductive to what the outcomes that I should be chasing. So again, personal inventory, this is a 1 to 4 hour exercise that you're going to do through intense self-reflection. I would recommend doing it when you're feeling really burnt out. If you start to feel, if you're someone who can recognize the signs of burnout easily in yourself, if you've been through it a couple of times, maybe you have that skill. I would recommend doing that at the beginning, or doing this at the beginning of that curve to really help actually stifle that burnout and maybe help you recover from it quicker. You can also use this if you just got some hard news at work. Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be about work, but I'm using work as the key example because this is what typically prompts me to do this. Maybe you got passed up for a promotion. Maybe you were competing for a job and you didn't get it. Maybe you got a poor performance review, and that can be pretty earth-shattering for a lot of people, especially if they are generally high performers. As far as best practices, I like to do this pen and journal. I like to do it generally at like a coffee shop or a library, and I like to carve out specific time for it. This is not something that I'm going to just decide to do on a whim because I'm feeling tired or run down. If I do decide to do it because I'm feeling tired and worn down, I'm going to go somewhere else for it. If you have a dedicated study space in your house or maybe like a common area in your apartment building, that would be the type of area that I recommend doing it at. Don't do it in a place where you are always kind of working or get a lot of work done. Generally, you want it to be kind of a novel environment where you can garner novel insights. Doug, do you have anything to add about the basics there?
Yeah, all great stuff so far. Talking about when you should do it, and I think you really covered all the points. Is just actually, I'll say more best practices is coming at this with a place of intention. Like you said, like this isn't going to be something that you're doing like while you have a show on, or you're like bouncing between this and like scrolling through Instagram or something like that. Is really carving out time and sitting down and saying like, I need to figure this out, because what a personal inventory is almost like a reflection on how things have been when you're at a place of like identity crisis.
Yeah,
That's how I look at
good
it
point.
for me, and how I've used this is similar, like what you're saying, Ronnie, for work. You know, getting a bad news on a performance review or something like that, but also things like divorce, right? Things like loss, grief, very pivotal moments in life where you're like, what is happening? What is the meaning of what's going on right now? So really, really looking at this and focusing from a place of intention, and being really, really authentic and honest with yourself is another best practice, I'll say. Because look, I mean, even looking at some of the sample questions, which we'll get into right now, it's going to require you to answer things about yourself that you don't necessarily want to dig into, but you'll need to dig into if you want to discover the things that you need to work on, and how to get out of the place you're in. So just wanted to add that in as a best practice. But question number one, the brainstorming current state versus brainstorming ideal state. What does that look like for you, Ronnie? Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So the reason it's kind of phrased a little bit vaguely, and I would say that you can do this for your health, you can do this for whatever. Let's talk about this for like burnout at work. Let's continue to use that as the example. For me, I actually had to go through this personal inventory earlier in 2023, like around August, I believe. I was just having a horrible time at work, and I just felt like I couldn't get the outcomes, and I was just tripping all over myself, kind of that treadmill effect. And I knew that my mindset was off. I knew it had to do with my mindset, but what happened was I just kept going into the office. I just kept seeing the same people, doing the same things, never taking this time to do this inventory. And as a result, I couldn't really find my footing, so to speak. So with all of these questions, another best practice that I would recommend, that I actually didn't do this most recent time, but talking to Doug before we started, I realized that it would have been a very good idea to do this, is to time yourself and give yourself a uniform amount of time to answer every question. So brainstorming current state versus brainstorming ideal state, what I would do is I would set a 10 to 15 minute timer if we're talking about mindset, and just write every single word that comes to mind in your current state. Are you feeling hopeless? Are you feeling wounded? Are you feeling, energized by things maybe you shouldn't be energized by? Are you feeling dependent on things? Go through every single word that you can really think of here. We say sample questions, but honestly, this gap analysis of current state versus ideal state, I think, is really important to include in this inventory.
Mm-hmm.
I will move on to question number 2 here in a sec, but do you have anything that you would add as far as brainstorming current state versus ideal state? Before you do that, sorry, I got ahead of myself. With ideal state, do the same thing, set the same amount of time, and really be really be dreamy about it, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is a time of crisis. You probably haven't given yourself and I use crisis loosely, but it could be a time of identity crisis, and you probably haven't been giving yourself time to think about what you could be and what your potential is. So during that brainstorming of the ideal state, really take some time. Like, I wrote the word jovial in my last ideal state brainstorming session, and like, I still don't think I'm jovial. I don't think anybody would really describe me as jovial. But like ideally, I'd like to be kind of a jovial guy, or at least feel jovial, right? So
Mm-hmm.
be a little dreamy with it. Be a little bit head in the clouds with that ideal state. But sorry, I cut you off.
No,
I didn't cut
that's
you
what I
off. I
was going
just
to add.
didn't let you answer.
That's what I was going to add is do the same thing, but with the ideal state, and be borderline delusional with the ideal state of, and specifically because when you're in that current state, when you're doing this personal inventory and you're in that place of like you said, crisis, or you're like, I don't know who I am or what my direction is. I'm burnt out. I'm overwhelmed, overstimulated. It's hard to think of your ideal state at just a baseline of like, oh, I just want to be, meets expectations. So really get borderline delusional with your ideal state of what you'd like to do or who you'd like to be, the version of yourself that you want to become, because that'll help when it brings you to that question number 2 of what part of this do I have to own. So do you want to jump into that?
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll talk about these two, I think, kind of not interchangeably, but at the same time, which is question number 2 and question number 3. What part of this do I have to own? And what part of this is out of my control? Again, with these, I would assign a certain amount of time, make it as long as it needs to be. And during this, what part of this do I have to own? My idea with this is it's bordering on like confessional. It's like going
Mm.
back and looking over the span of time that has led you to this time. If let's say you're struggling with your weight or with your with maybe you track your resting heart rate like a maniac like I do, and your resting heart rate has gone from 48 to 70 over the last 6 months or whatever. Somehow maybe that looks like literally going back through your bank statements and saying, wow, I ordered DoorDash on 57 different occasions in 70 days or whatever it is. Like, get granular with this. Were you rude to a coworker and created tension that you didn't need to create on top of all of this? Like, what did you own? What part of this are you actively owning? What part of your mindset that you're currently in do you choose to enter a victim mentality to enter into, right? Again, be as specific as possible. This, not to bring it into any sort of like faith-based thing, but this should feel like you're confessing something. And at some level, your brain knows that you needed to get it off your chest anyway. So it's helpful to really get granular with it. As far as seeing what's out of your control, again, give yourself some time here and let yourself off the hook for the things that you really had no control over, right? This is going to be different for a lot of different people. And it might also look like and sound like some excuses actually when you look at the list of the things that you owned on the side. But that's okay. This is to kind of give yourself some slack and understand moving forward, like, okay, these things I'm never going to have control over. I am going to have control over my reactions. I am going to have control how I'm going to let it play out as the narrative inside of my head. But like, if I'm struggling to hit quota as a sales rep at a software company, not that I would ever be that, but like if that was what I was struggling with, I can't fight the market forces. I really can't. I can't help that interest rates hiked, and as a result, the entire market has been deflationary ever since. I'm not going to be able to fight that. But what I can do is control my mindset and the narrative that I create as a result of it. But again, cut yourself some slack in those things that are outside of your control, because it will narrow your scope. Like we talked about in the intention episode, it will narrow your worldview so that you only have to think about those things that are inside of your control. Doug, what do you have on these?
Great. That's great. I'm I'm reflecting in my life too on different areas. And I think number 2 and 3 definitely play into each other. It's just, like you said, don't fall victim to the fixed mindset. Don't fall into that trap of, well, this is only happening because of XYZ, all things that have nothing to do with me. And, talking about work, a specific example, my last performance review did not go how I wanted it to. And for so long, I just like spiraled down this thought process of like, well, my boss didn't get this and didn't set this expectation and, stepped in halfway through my tenure, so she didn't even know my job performance before any of that happened, blah, blah, blah. But when I really came down to it, it was like, there are some things that I don't have control over. I need to not spend any time on those things. What I do need to focus on is, were there times when you should have been working an 8-hour day and you worked a 3-hour day? Yeah. Were there times where you should have been sitting down at your desk, but you were downstairs playing with your son? Yeah. And why? Like, I understand why, because it's difficult, right? It's difficult being both mom and dad working from home, the kid's there, he's 2, he's not in school, so we have to balance our schedules and blah, blah, blah. There's tons of reasons why certain things happen that we fall into, but at the end of the day, we have to own what is ours to own and say, okay, how do I do this differently? What direction do I need to move in for there to be a different outcome? Because if I continue down this road, it's going to result in the feeling that I'm feeling right now, this crisis, this feeling of overwhelm, where I'm like, yeah, I want to do all of these things, but doing all of these things result in incongruence, in me knowing that I'm not living up to the full capabilities of my potential, of who I'm meant to be. And that's where it goes back to that definition of intention being getting out of the passenger seat and back into the driver's seat and saying, like, I'm sick of just waking up and days going by and me just riding along with it, because that's what leads to overwhelm for me. That's what leads to that burnout, is like, I'm not taking the reins here and I'm watching all these things happen. It's like the whole memento mori thing where you watch the days count down, and that should be all the motivation you need to get off your ass and get work done. When you look at like, oh, I only have 23,000 days left, I better make them count. So what part do I have to own and what do I have to let go of that's out of my control? So I think that's great.
That is great.
Yeah. Minimum viable change in 3 areas.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Yeah. So again, I like this idea of minimum viable change because essentially, and again, these are just sample questions. You're going to want to come up with an inventory system that works for you. Cal Newport has a great one, really in-depth framework, honestly, but it's great. Jordan Peterson, I know, has this whole self-authoring program as well. There's a ton of different, even Jan Yeager, who we talked about last week, has some great reflection exercises in her books, apparently. And I would say that this minimum viable change is really great because, again, this is at a season where you're feeling burnt out, where you're feeling overwhelmed, you're feeling overstimulated. We're going to talk about another type of audit that you can do when that's not the case. But for right now, you're clearly responsible for a lot. You're all over the place. You feel like you need to make a change now. What's the minimum viable change, and what are the 3 areas or the 3 practices of that change that would have the greatest impact or steer you in the right direction? So look at what you should really look at is look at the answers to the 3 questions above. What's your current state? What's your ideal state? What do you own and what do you not own? If I'm looking at this right now, I would say, what's an activity I can add that would get me towards my ideal state? What's an activity that or what's a part of this that I own that I can either improve or double down on? And what part of this is outside of my control that I can eliminate from my scope, right? If we're going back to the example of being a sales rep in a turbulent economy and feeling really down about that, I'm saying, okay, my ideal state is to be a team player. What does that look like? Well, maybe I'm going to have a one-on-one with a teammate every week or with a junior teammate and kind of mentor them, right? That's being a good team player. Okay, cool. That's a 15-minute check-in. Very, very small change. Number 2, what part of this do I have to own? I wrote down in that confessional part of the exercise, I'm expected to make maybe 40 calls a day. We both know that on Fridays I've been making 20. Okay, on Fridays I'm going to hit the minimum expectation. I'm not going to make 90. I'm not going to make 100. The minimum viable change would be getting me to the point where my manager and where my boss has agreed, or where my leadership has agreed, that I should at least be fulfilling that part of the responsibility. And then I also know that this podcast that I listen to, not this podcast is great, but I listen to a business podcast and they're doom and gloom about the world around them. I'm just going to stop listening to them for a little while. Like, yeah, it's informative, it's entertaining, but like they're reinforcing ideas that I don't want to have in my mind. Okay, great. So you've added 15 minutes of a meeting, you've added 20 calls to your weekly call agenda or whatever in this job, and you've also subtracted a podcast. And already think about the directional change that you've made in your life. So when I say minimum viable change, it is just that. It's the smallest possible thing that you could do to change your direction significantly enough where you can leave that season of burnout or overwhelm or overstimulation or negative mental narrative, whatever you're stuck in. And again, I would add questions. Maybe I would subtract one of these or change it up if you'd like. But like overall, these are sample questions that if I'm doing my personal inventory today, those are four that I'm at least starting with.
Yeah.
Doug, do you have anything else on these?
No, I think that's great. And yeah, like you said, Ronnie, you could do some research, look at some other questions that you could maybe ask yourself, but this is a really great starting point. I know number 4, I will say, might be tough. It's ironic because it's the minimum viable change, so it's really thinking small and saying what small changes can I make. But a lot of us, especially when we're in this place of overwhelm, are like, I need to make a drastic shift
Yeah.
in the work that I'm doing. And that a lot of the times is what causes us to, maybe for a week we feel great and we're like, oh, I got this new routine and these new things that I'm doing. But then I burn out again, or I hit a wall again, is because we're trying to make so much change so quickly, but change is a process. So I think starting small like that 1% gradually day over day type of mentality is huge. It's such a big win because over the long term, over 30, 60, 90 days, a year, 2 years, look at the trajectory that you're on versus where you were when you were in that place of burnout. And it all came from just small incremental changes gradually. So
Yeah.
4 really great questions to start out with.
And I did forget one more thing. Sorry. We did not plan an outline for this, so we're just kind of going off the dome. Speaking of intentionality.
Right.
But one thing that I would recommend, and I know that this is going to be a part of the next thing we talk about, when you do that, when you set that minimum viable change, set a timeline on it. For a personal inventory, I would recommend 2 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks to maybe 30 days, and just add something to your calendar where you check in with those 3 questions. Like, how did you do? It doesn't have to be really data driven, but just kind of see like, hey, did this actually make any tangible impact on my life? If not, maybe I need to go back and explore what those areas actually are and what the minimum viable change actually would be. But that's the personal inventory. You use that for in response to maybe identity crisis or burnout, or at least that's what we've used it for. Doug, do you want to introduce the other type of audit?
Yeah. So this is talking about kind of the opposite now, starting with the personal inventory coming from a place of, oh my God, I've lost sight of who I am. I'm burnt out. What's happening? Life audit is kind of starting with, I don't know what I want to accomplish. I've never really sat down and mapped out the goals that I'd like to accomplish. Or maybe you have, but you never like saw it all the way through type of thing. So this is really an opportunity to start with like, I don't know how, but I really want to start living a more intentional lifestyle. So that kind of answers question number 1 of what is it? It's an audit. It's just a rating of different areas of your life to determine where you're at versus kind of where you'd like to be and how to get there, or the basics of how to get there. When you should do it, I think it's really, whenever you're at that place of, for me, thinking about this place of incongruence where I had never really envisioned tangibly the version of myself that I wanted to become. I've had these ideas of like, oh, it'd be cool if I could do this, or like, yeah, I could see myself doing that, but never really sat down and said like, in X amount of time, this is what I'd like to be doing. And these are all the things that would lead me to that place. So when you should do this is not necessarily when you've reached a place of burnout, but kind of to kick things off when you're like, I don't have a sense of direction. I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know what I'd like to accomplish. Let me do a life audit and see where I go from there. Right. So it's step one. It's kind of step one in the personal development, self-improvement process. Some best practices here, similar to the personal inventory, is just being explicitly honest with yourself, carving out the time. We keep using this word intentional, and there is a reason we use it, and there is a reason it's the name of our podcast. But it is very important that you set some intention and carve out time to focus specifically and explicitly on this practice, so you don't get distracted. And if you do, give yourself the grace, but then pull yourself right back. It's like meditating. But pen and paper. If you're that kind of person that processes things by writing it down, if you have your note taking system, if it's notes on your phone or if it's your OneNote, or however you take notes, just being very methodical about how you map this out. Ronnie, am I missing anything there so far?
No. As far as the basics, I mean, we talked about being in a novel location for the personal inventory. I would say for this one, it matters less. In fact, like I do some sort of audit quarterly and annually. That's more like kind of a overall goal setting criteria, but I go into a lot of the stuff we're about to talk about here. And I actually like to do it at the same desk that I do all of my other work, because I kind of want it to like set the tone, right? Like I want to, if I know that I'm going to be, let's say I have a goal to write 1,000 words a day or something. If I know that this is the place that I'm going to be writing those 1,000 words, then I want to set that goal there, right? So as opposed to the personal inventory where you're kind of trying to escape that those ruts you've created for yourself, this is like carve the groove. And then the only other thing I would say about a best practice for when you should do it is, hey, think about doing this after you accomplish a really big goal, right? Like that day after you landed a huge promotion at work, or maybe you just left a really busy season at work that you were prioritizing in your life for a long time. And it's like, all right, I don't really know what to do with myself. Maybe you quit a job. Maybe you got a windfall of money, or you graduated college, I think graduating college is actually an excellent example of when you should do this, because for the first 21 to 22 years of your life, you've been guided in a curriculum-based structure. And then one day you're plopped down as an adult. And it's like, I don't even know what to do. I don't know what direction I need to move in. I know I have to get, a job at Goldman Sachs at some point, or I have to start working that job at some point that I got in college. But like, I don't know what else being an adult is. That's a really good example of when you should use something like this. But it's really for those moments where you can't answer those very foundational questions. But that's it.
Yeah, that's great. It sets you up, but then it also keeps you on track. So it's something that you can do cyclically or quarterly, or whatever cadence makes sense after a really monumental win. I love that. And then so the order, and again, there might be more steps to this that you discover that works for you. I think these are four very basic steps for a life audit. But the first one, I think it's hard to get away from this one or get around this one, is what are the areas for which I'm responsible? And number two is rating your performance in those areas. So the areas for which you're responsible, I think a really simple way to put this is just the different aspects of your life that you want to focus on. So for it's going to be different for different people. For me, it's my quality as a husband, as a father. Those are two separate areas. In my job, right? So career, my personal, right? Maybe you could lump husband and father in like home life, right? So it depends on how you approach this, but it's thinking of the different areas of your life that you're wanting to focus on for this audit, and then you're rating your performance in these areas. And again, the scale that you use might be different. We were just talking about this before we recorded. I use a scale of 1 to 10. I think 1 to 5 might be a really strict, rigid scale to rate yourself on. If you're doing anything below 4 out of 5, then you're starting to get really tough on yourself. So I usually rate myself on a scale of 1 to 10. But Ronnie, you said you use a different scale.
Yeah. So I like anytime I'm like rating my performance on something, which is actually something I don't do often, but I will do it in certain edge cases, specifically when I am thinking through like the roles in my life or the areas in my life. I either rate myself on a scale of 1 to 100, which is really just like, I don't know why I do that. I think it's just because I like getting as granular as possible with numbers, or I'll
Mm-hmm.
define criteria within the areas. So, like, let's say you and I are both husbands. Husband is one of the areas. Okay. That would break down into am I serving my wife well? Am I leaning into her love language? Are we having date nights? How's the bedroom life? All, like 5 different areas, right up what right, and then I would rank those on a scale of 1 to 10, and then I would average those, and that gives me my rating. That's how I really like to do it, because it's like, okay, now I have a definite. Now I'm definitionally, I know what success looks like in that, and then my and this sounds like we get really crazy with it, and I think when you do this, you kind of should, because life
Yeah.
will take care of the making it more casual side of it,
Yeah.
right? Like life will take care of the putting it on the back burner. Um, it's having the intention to be really detailed in the moments that you need to be really detailed, and be really granular in the moments that you need to be really granular, and then kind of let life happen, so to speak.
Yeah. I like that. I think pause that and watch that segment again on how to rate your performance in those areas, because that gets really, if you're trying to get really granular about it, which again I think for stuff like this is important too. Um, I literally I'm like, how am I as a husband? Scale of 1 to 10. And for the quick for the quick life audit type of thing. But if you're really sitting down and trying to map out some things, then really break it down. Husband category, 3 or 4 criteria. Work category, 3 or 4 criteria. Father category, 3 or 4 criteria. Student, brother, what the list goes on for whatever areas of life you're trying to scale yourself in. And then the rest of this is pretty straightforward, right? Number 3 is, where do I want those ratings to be? So you could be, I'm sure we would all love to be 10 out of 10 in all areas of our life, but um, talking about minimum viable change in a personal inventory, think
Yeah.
about that from this perspective. If I feel like, and earlier in 2023, I probably would have said, or no, I'll go even further back. 2019, 2020, I probably would have said, father, I'm like 3 out of 10, where I would like, as opposed to where I'd like to be. So for me to say, if I score myself 3 out of 10, I realistically, for this next push of my life, I just want to get to 5. I'm not trying to, in the course of 6 months, go from 3 to 10, because that's that same, I'm going to burn out. This is going to feel too hard, and I'm going to throw in the towel really quickly. So I'm going to say, if I'm at a 3 right now, I want to be 5, 6. And then it's looking at goals and habits to start building in that short term, in that 60 days, 90 days type of span of, what do I need to start focusing on? What do I need to start getting rid of as far as habits in my life? What things do I need to start incorporating to make it easier for me to follow in that trajectory, to go from that 3 to that 6, or to that 3 to that 5, or from the 1 to the 3, right? Or maybe from 7 to 9, right? Or 8 to 10,
Yeah.
whatever makes sense for you. So it's minimum viable change, not overwhelming yourself with kind of the improvements that have to be made, and thinking about it more in the short term, even starting with like 2 weeks from now, this is what I'd like to see different, and then go to a month, right? And then build from there. But following those steps, I think, especially if you're like, I have no idea what direction I want to move in, or like Ronnie said, I just accomplished something huge. I just accomplished the big goal. Now I have no idea what I want to do, because all my energy was focused on this one thing that I just accomplished. Now what? Sit down and perform a life audit and see where you can go from there. But Ronnie, anything else to add before we wrap this up?
Yeah, a couple things just really quick on points 3 and 4. On point 3, I would almost think about this like you're at a starting video game RPG character creation menu, and you have stats like strength, intelligence, charisma, agility, I don't know, stealth. I don't know why I'm acting like I've never played an RPG. I've literally dedicated like thousands and thousands of hours of them, of my life to them. But you only have a certain amount of points that you can allocate, right? So like realistically, if you have 6 areas of your life for which you're responsible, you're just not going to be a 10 in all of them. I would figure out which ones are more important to be a 10 in than the others, right? If you're a husband and a new father, like it's probably more important for you to be a 10 in those areas than it is for you to be a 10 at your job, honestly. And that's a hard thing for me to think about because I do often just want to be the best in the world at what I do for whatever reason. But that's the way that you can think about it. And over time, be realistic with yourself. You're going to build capacity. You're going to fill up more of your experience bar to keep it in more video game terms. And eventually you'll have the ability to be a 10 in maybe 3 areas because of the habits that you've accumulated and because of the relational equity that you've accumulated or the skills that you've accumulated. But when you're first starting out, I would think about it like that, like at the character creation screen. And then the only other thing I would say is like for these goals and habits in the short term, take it, like Doug said, either from 2 weeks to 90 days at a time. And again, make sure you establish some time in your calendar, put a reminder on your phone, whatever it needs to be, to just go back and check on them, right? How did you do versus this goal? And if it's more of a loose goal, I personally prefer, more smart trackable goals, but like whatever, if it's more of a loose goal, like I want to be more spiritual or I want to read more, just intuitively track. How did that go? What did I feel like I got out of it? And again, have a timeline on it. At least have the T in SMART, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to see where you've actually grown. But beyond that, I think you perfectly covered it.
Awesome. Yeah, the check-ins are super important. So even if it's at the end of every day, just asking, hey, if I want to be more spiritual, or I want to read more. Did I read today? Did I pray today? Did I meditate today? Right? Just even asking yourself that question and having some form of habit tracking that you can incorporate keeps you accountable. I think that's a great add. Yeah, that's really it for those two. So thank you for sticking with us over the past 40 minutes. This was a fun format for this type of stuff. I'm excited to do this more often. But next week we will be talking about we'll be recapping our challenge from January, the hard mode reset, our learnings, our takeaways, our pitfalls, so on and so forth. And then we'll also be introducing our challenge for the month of February. So excited.
We don't even know it yet.
We don't even
know.
So
if you have suggestions, drop it in the comments. Actually,
what challenge would you like to see us take on? And then we're gonna meet to plan, and then we'll determine something, and then we'll announce it during our next episode. And then we are also, for those interested, if anyone wants to join along for a book club, our next book that we're reading is, thank you, Ronnie, The Slight Edge by Jeff Olson. So we will be reading through that. It's about how many pages? Less than 300, right?
Barely. It's about 260.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you round up, I guess it's 300, but less than 300 pages. So should be a solid read. We have about 3 weeks to do that. It'll be our 3rd episode in the month of February. So 3 episodes from now. Yeah, anything you want to add before we get out of here?
No, man, I'm good. This was actually this was super. I feel like I learned a little bit about this stuff. So yeah, man, I'm good. I think you can take us out of here.
Cool. All right. Well, yes, use this episode as you see fit. Break it down by the chapters. Go back, watch it as many times as you need to. Thank you. If you're still here with us, feel free to subscribe.
You would be the first one.
Check us out. Huh?
Nothing. I said if you're still here with us, you would be the first one.
You would be the first. I hate you for saying that. Well, the one person that's here, please subscribe. Find confidence in your intention.
We desperately need it.
Trust the process. We desperately need you. We'll see you next time.
Toodles. Bye.